of assessment and tool of understanding on the part of the teacher whether what is taught has been received. Now there are also freeloaders in this exercise. So that is a challenge that was expressed. So there, what they do is they try to have these freeloaders identified by proper mechanisms. Otherwise, what they would do is they would provide them what he said, the repeat test. We have similar practices in Symbiosis as well. Second thing was that for the small group discussion, I mean from the global classroom, how we move to small group discussion, and thematic small groups or modular small groups could be organized where students will have more closed door discussion, more intensive discussion. The third idea was about using internships as experiential avenues, which is again an innovative pedagogy in international law. Now, there was this idea which was coming about, in addition to mastery, there was another idea, the sense of achievement, the sense of affiliation. So one of the faculties pointed out in our group that we have Indian example of Harish Salve, who is defending the case of this captive hostage held in Pakistan, who is on the death row. So how Harish Salve emerged as a lawyer from Mumbai, as a local lawyer, and eventually became the defender of international human rights at International Court of Justice. So students had kept these role models in front of them. So we were drawing on the discussion that was there in the plenary, and we were developing these ideas. So this teacher was expressing how he keeps such examples in front of students. We have had Justice Bandari, who being Supreme Court judge, later was elevated to International Court of Justice. So such role models create a sense of goal, and they also create a sense of accomplishment and achievement. Then they also said that there was this idea of starting the class discussion, because one of our Australian colleagues has a very strong view. Lecture method is not the problem, but bad lecture method is the problem. So how to make your lecture method to be used in the best way? The suggestion given was making it, the beginning of the lecture itself, more interactive. Like for example, where is students' understanding of the concept? Suppose you're starting with the idea of human rights. What's your idea of human right? What's your understanding of human right? You plot it on the board or on the slide, and then you give the hardcore legal concepts, articles. Now the last point that I would like to bring to your attention and to the house, which was transpiring in our group, was there is a very low reading trait. I mean, students don't want to read in these days. They want shortcut answers. So they want the PowerPoint presentations to be put on the learning management system, and they would only prepare what is there in the PowerPoint presentation for the examination. Now, how do we deal with this? How do we inculcate reading? Some of the professors expressed that they have this exercise by which students are made to read original books, not textbooks, original cases, and not annotated in the textbook, because the case reading habit will not be encouraged in students. And bringing about the understanding of concept by doing, in terms of, one great example that was given was of Human Rights Law Clinic, where refugees, Rohingya refugees, 2 Rohingya refugees from Delhi were brought to the class as live case, and then the students interacted with them, and thereby they built the concept of refugee law and how refugee law is in action. Another was to take students, which Symbiosis uses in internationalization, because we believe in wholesome internationalization, not only in terms of exchanges and mobility, but in terms of credit transfers, in terms of bringing, whenever international students come here for a semester exchange or credit transfer, exposing them to the law and justice in globalizing context, which is maybe exposure to the poverty, exposure to vulnerability in slums and other places, showing how law is very far from the text in reality. Now these kinds of experiential learning will broaden their perspective, stretch their minds, and it is the one which is the basic minimum standard in terms of contextualizing and using cultural diversity, using the diversity of manifestation of rights or justice to enrich their experience. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.
And that's terrific. That is a wonderful example of how to meet the challenge that, in terms of a podium course, I'm telling you, you tell me back at the end of the semester, that dynamic needs to be changed. But in our secular religion of the law, it's not just a belief system. We believe in the law, but also we are products now of science. Prove it to me. It sounds good, and I'm sure it's very effective, and students like it. How do you convince your faculty to do it? It's a lot of work. You have to prove it to them. You have to prove it to the regulators. Say, this is an effective way. I need more resources to do this. And that's the challenge in terms of what the NIC, the Network Improvement Community, hopes to address. We're going to float ideas like this. And we first start out in the doctrinal study groups to say, in international law, in human rights, here's a structure. Here's one component of how I teach a certain concept. The challenge next is prove it. Prove the concept. How do we do that? We're not equipped. We're not the smartest people in the room when it comes to that. Smarter people are people like Professor O'Sullivan. Shake your head. Yes. Prove it, because that's the way that we can convince our regulators, that's the way we can convince our faculty, and that's the way we can convince our students. Here's the proof. This is why this is effective. This is why we're doing it. And by proving it doesn't mean that one test case, here's the result. We constantly have to improve. I tried out this method, and let me suggest a few other things that I found to be effective. But once again, what's the measure? And here's the measure. It's iterative. Constant improvement. That's what a network improvement community is. And that's what we want to start out with in our doctrinal study groups. And why is that? Because you say, gee, you know, what we talk about here cuts across the board, does it not? It's about legal education, whether it's human rights, contracts, or whatever. Our identity, though, as teachers of the law, is so embedded into what we teach. It's not embedded into how we teach. It's embedded to what we teach. And so let's take a look at that affinity group when we looked at trying to structure this. And what's a much more effective way is that this is what you teach. Okay, fine. Let's talk to people who teach that. There's a commonality in terms of conversation. You've agreed to content, which is fairly simple. You know, I remember when we first started out this, and there was a question, it's so complicated, my subject matter is really, really complex. I said, get a book, look at the table of contents, okay, and get an agreement as to what the basics are. Oh, that's pretty easy. Good. I think we can get an agreement as to content. There are differences. Fine, we can highlight that. But on a whole, commercial law is going to be commercial law. And there are the differences to point them out. But you can have an agreement fairly quickly in terms of content. How do you teach it? Well, first, in writing, let's look at your syllabus and have people comment on it. But the syllabus can well be your table of contents. So the next step in terms of a study group is, how are you teaching it? And hopefully at that time then, innovative teaching techniques are floated up. It says, well, this is the way I do it. Here's the way in this section that I do it. Here's a simulation. Here's a little problem that I break people out into small groups. Let's spread that around within the doctrinal study group. And then most importantly then, how do you measure it? Is it effective or not? And that's something that we haven't confronted yet. And we're going to be working very closely with the people who are able to and who are professional in and are experts in. And how do you gauge change? How do you measure? Because we need to prove it. Andrew, I'm going to turn to you. Commercial law.
Is there a question?
Basically an idea.
Well, we had a very vibrant discussion, and it was very insightful in the commercial law doctrinal group. And we discussed practicalities as well as more philosophical things about how to teach commercial law. And I mean, some of the practicalities are to do with technology, and it's maintaining communication with the doctrinal study group through like a WhatsApp group or an email group where we can float ideas and get feedback on syllabus. which we did do in the previous 12 months. There was several examples of people circulating their syllabus and getting feedback on it. And it was also very interesting to see the input at Symbiosis Law School in particular that the industry has into the syllabus curriculum. And I know, Frank, you're probably averse to this because you don't want anyone to impose things, but it was very interesting to have that different perspective. I suggested during the last 12 months that the IALS become more prominent on LinkedIn and try and elicit interest and more activity on online platforms like LinkedIn. Of course, the trouble with that, or the trouble with having communication groups outside of the group site platform, is the institutional memory. As members of the group come and go, you want to know what is being discussed and the knowledge that has been gained. So I really believe we need to think about streamlining the group site platform. It's a good platform, but it can be better. And simplifying and opening up the avenues of communication between faculty around the world. I mean, that's really what this network improvement... network improvement community is really just a fancy word for colleagues sharing. Really, it's colleagues sharing. That's all it is.
Well, no, I will have to interject though if Tony Bernard was saying, no.
Mm-hmm.
It's more than just a social group or even an intellectual group or a learning society. There's an objective.
Mm-hmm.
And it's constantly then looking at how to achieve that objective by engaging people to test things out. And I mean, that's what the Carnegie Foundation is about.
Well, I mean, I have a problem with this to begin with, and I'll be frank. I want to see people's heads come up, because when there's something confrontational, it gets people's attention. And that's an idea in itself. Being confrontational in class and challenging students and really forcing them to take a position or to look within themselves at what they truly believe. Like, for example, in commercial law, really get people to think about economics. Is capitalism better than socialism? For developing poverty or improving outcomes in that respect. Getting people to engage with things like that. And I mean, over the previous few days, I've heard various things about what we do as law schools. And I mean, that's the main question. You can't talk about pedagogy and methodology if you don't nail down the essential question, what do we do as law schools? Some of the various propositions I've heard are, we teach skills, that's fine. We teach the law, that's obvious. We inculcate students into the rule of law, okay. And then finally, we, as one of the members in the doctrinal session said, we give students a critical mindset, okay. Now, I'm not going to take the position that, it's a little bit of everything. That would be the easy way out. I think to abstract and synthesize from all these positions, law school is fundamentally a transformational experience. In one end come naive, or even worse, unnecessarily arrogant young people come in one end, and like a hot piece of metal being forged between a hammer and an anvil, we give them a character and we transform them into people who are comfortable in their own skin and people who are confident enough to be what I would call a lawyer statesman, an ambassador that exists in the space between power and powerlessness, okay? And that transformational process is, I think, what we all have in common. Whether it's a civil law system or a common law system, I think that transformational process is the key. And I do have some ideas on how to achieve that, but I don't want to take up too much time. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Now, transformational, that's a great narrative, okay? That packages up, does it not, what we're doing? That makes us special. I'm glad that you studied comparative literature. But studying comparative literature is not going to take you to where we, in the law faculty of the law school, will take you. that gives us then a sense of identity. It gives then a sense in terms of the student and why they're there. And it's just not to go out and go into private practice and make a lot of money, but rather it's that transformation. How do we prove that? How do we show that? How do we convince people of that? Because I agree. I think that's the end result. And hopefully that's what we do. But have we lost some of that perspective and mission when it's somebody imposing on us to say, well, you have to give 6 credits of procedure versus this versus that, and there's very little space left in your curriculum to look at, delve deeply into this transformational process. Well, it will happen. But will that happen? Cramming their wonderful, bright, acquisitive minds, as we used to do, with a lot of information, with a lot of facts, that doesn't work anymore. They get it right there, instantaneously. So, yes,
yeah.
Transformation.
Can I just add that I'm not sure you can teach that kind of transformation. I think you need to inflict it on students by really challenging them, and that will. And you can't challenge them unless you yourself challenge your own presuppositions. So, for example, we all have the presupposition law is better than lawlessness. For example, lawlessness has a bad reputation, but I mean, from a commercial law perspective. In Singapore, in the financial sector, they've got regulatory sandboxes where they take away the laws and they let innovation happen and spontaneity, and it produces brilliant results. Okay, so challenging students in that respect will force them to take a position or to look within themselves. I mean, I call these intellectual landmines, and we need to plant them in our curriculum, these intellectual landmines. Like, for example, telling students or challenging students and saying, you know, the rule of law is actually a noble lie. There is no autonomous, uncorrupted principle out there that applies itself. The relationship between man and law is symbiotic, which is very appropriate. You need humans to understand and apply the law. So we do live under the rule of man, but we're just too scared to admit it. We all pander to the rule of law because it's a religious precept, because law is a secular religion.
We've deified the law. That's what we owe our allegiance to. That's will make the determination if you follow the process in the law. So transformation. And you challenge them. Good. So how do we build that then? But then once again, let's prove it. That it does transform. And it is transformative, because when you start in any class and you wander into questions like this, Professor, is that going to be on the exam? Of course. How do you get them to come along that they're engaged in a process? They're not just sitting there as when they were in high school, or for those who have a graduate education in college, and saying, oh, is that going to be on the exam? Okay, fine, I write it down, I'm going to give this back to you, because that's what you're going to test me on. It's a process. It's a process. So good. I think we're coming. Is there any agreement, disagreement? Jürgen?
Disagreement may be the wrong word, but
okay.
Maybe we should also land with it, because we're in the stratosphere right now.
Absolutely.
There is a lot of things that are going on, for example, around the educational framework that would stifle to some degree what we've just talked about. For example, the need to achieve good GPAs to get have access to whatever the good jobs are, whether they're in private practice or in government. There are the whole educational system really does not support these types of aspirations, and at the same time, what of course we want to do and have to do is to instill in students or whoever is engaged with the law this notion that the law differs from arbitrariness, and that it is not what I want, but that I have to provide a narrative that fits within to that framework to take the subjectivity out of it. I think this is the core that where we're going to. But this happens in that framework of reality, and this doesn't take anything away from this goal, but you know, we were getting a little bit lofty here, I thought.
That's the idea here. I want to be lofty because we live on the day-to-day, every day, and those who have the responsibility to administer. My word, I mean, you know, that your day is filled with the professor who comes in and says, my office is too small. I want more money for grants. I got, you know, so you're running the enterprise. Okay? For the professor, you're inundated day to day with the students and they're doing this, or why haven't you been in class? And there's a succession of grandparents who have tragedy has struck them throughout the semester. And always before, when the paper is due, I co-teach with my wife, and I always turn to her and I said, I wonder this semester what tragedy is going to strike which students. And some of it's very legitimate, but some of it is way out there. But yes, I mean, I completely agree, okay, is that we live also in the real world. But the loftiness now is to take a look at trying to frame for ourselves, what is it that we do? What is it, that end product that we want? And then we have to look back and take a look at that logic map and model and say, can we do it? And it's, you know, we're going to keep going back and forth. Oh, I need this resource. This is the activity that I need to do. Is it going to achieve where I want to be? This one.
Actually, Jürgen